Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, what a week in Harrisburg. Governor Wolf loses the open records lawsuit. Marcus Brown fails to get confirmed for police commissioner. The sting. But before that, we have our health care update. We'll get to that and more following these words.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, Daly, I hate this expression. I shouldn't say this, I guess, but it's always breaking news. There's breaking news about every 5 minutes in Harrisburg, particularly in June with the legislature and the governor. In effect, can I say not always in agreement? But first, we're going to talk about the budget. We're going to get into some issues involving health care. One of the experts that we call in from time to time, Dr. Stuart Shapiro. He heads the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association. We'll talk about something calm, Dr. Stuart, the budget, given all the other considerations and issues that are before the legislature and the governor. You'll be the calming. You'll be the calming part of the program. All right. Let's talk about the budget and where it all goes. What's your sense? You've covered many budgets.
You know, you talk about breaking news. The budget is not about breaking news. Yeah. I once drove an 18-wheeler, and we went into first gear, and it lumbered into second and third. And during April and May, we've been in first, second. Now we're getting into third. Right. And just as we move into June and into the second half of June, we're getting into fourth and fifth and sixth gear. And we're moving into high speed. Right. And we're just going into that phase now. And there's lots of debates going on the budget. And when the governor proposed his budget, there was a gigunda budget hole, $2.5 billion or so. Since then, the economy's improved, revenue collections have gone up, and there's still a small hole. But they're now getting down to brass tacks. Mm-hmm. And I know that they're going to work on a budget over the next several weeks, but I also know what is a good budget and a bad budget.
Right.
And I know that a budget that does not make seniors a priority is not a good budget. And I know a budget that does not protect the frail elderly is a wrong budget or a bad budget. And so we're hopeful, as an advocate for the elderly, sure, that the legislature and the governor get together to make sure that the frail elderly, especially those who need to live with dignity in their later years, are taken care of. And the folks who are advocates for the elderly, the frail elderly, are saying very simply, Governor, legislature, you've got a $30 billion budget. Can we take an extra $40 or $50 million, which will bring in another $50 million of federal dollars? Mm-hmm. So we're talking $50 million against $30 billion. Can you do something because of the federal match to make sure that services to the frail elderly aren't compromised?
So your point is, as it stands now, you have then, as I take it, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, some concerns about the current budget debate that it might not include the 40 or 50 million out of, as you accurately point out, $29-30 billion. You have some concerns that that won't happen.
I can tell you that currently the state Medicaid program, which is run by very good people, under-reimburses cost versus what they pay for care, about $23 a day. They underpay about $8,000 a year for every elderly person on Medicaid in nursing homes. Nursing homes have been forced to now say, we can't take everybody who wants to come in on Medicaid because we can't afford to stay in business and take care of them. So people are traveling to distances away from their homes in order to get care. And costs have gone up 2.4% a year every year for the last 3 years. And what the advocates for the elderly are saying, people like me, people who are members of AARP, are saying, we need additional dollars to go to the frail and elderly. And if the state spends out of this budget $40 or $50 million, it'll be matched by the federal dollars, and then care can improve, more staff can be hired, more technology can be purchased, staff turnover can be reduced, more competitive wages can be paid, capital improvements can be made, and everybody will benefit. We ought to make sure that our elderly, especially our frail elderly, live with dignity.
All right, stay with us. We're going to continue this conversation with Dr. Shapiro. There's some other aspects of senior care that I want to talk to him about, and then we'll get to all of these roiling issues in state government, and we'll do that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Well, here we are in the middle of the big budget debate. I'm chatting with, of course, for Pennsylvania's state budget, I'm chatting with Dr. Stuart Shapiro, fourth oldest senior citizen population in the nation. I think I'm right about that. We have lots of seniors, and Dr. Shapiro is one of the experts we call in from time to time to chat about this. Okay. Now, there are other things you would argue, and folks in the medical community in particular would argue, that drive up the cost of providing services to elderly.
Yep. And one of those is the tort cost. Do you remember back in 2002, doctors were leaving the state.
Right.
Malpractice insurance was becoming unaffordable. There were hundreds of frivolous lawsuits. Doctors were feeling beaten up. Insurance companies were making them settle for fear of going to court. And lots of money was leaving the state. Well, what happened is there was a law passed. There was some limits on punitive damages passed. Although people could sue and doctors and get whatever courts found appropriate, but there were some limits on the punitive damages. Laws were passed, the number of lawsuits dropped dramatically, and it all stabilized, and we're not losing doctors.
Right.
Same thing, same problem is now occurring in long-term care facilities, assisted living, personal care homes, and in nursing homes.
Can I interrupt you here for a minute?
Sure.
How many folks are in long-term care facilities, about approximately?
Probably about 130,000.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
But what's happening in this, and I know we only have a little bit of time, is these lawyers from out of state come in, and we've had 33 full-page ads in the last couple of months that are seeking to go after the employees, the nurses' aides in nursing homes, bring them in for depositions, harass them. And so there's legislation pending right now in the state legislature that's with the goal of driving some of the predatory lawyers out of state, especially two firms. But the critical problem is that with these lawyers comes extra cost. And last year, $150 million was spent on defending and making settlements to lawsuits. 90 million of that was paid by the state Medicaid program. 90 million. Now, you remember a few minutes ago we talked about whether we could get 40 or 50 million dollars out of an additional funds to help care for the elderly. That's not a lot of money when you look at these boatloads of money that are going out of Pennsylvania to predatory lawyers.
So what can be done about it?
There's legislation pending right now. It's going through the Senate. We're very thankful to Senator Scarnati, Senator White, Senator Vogel for working so hard on this, to the entire Senate. Hopefully, within the next 60 days, a bill will pass the Senate, will pass the House, and the governor will sign it, because that will protect seniors from these predatory lawyers that are driving up costs.
In a couple sentences,
it says very simply that anyone can sue a nursing home or a personal care home the same way they can sue a doctor or hospital, but it says that you can't get unlimited punitive damages unless there is purposeful mistakes. And so lawyers in Pennsylvania don't go after punitive damages very much. But what this does is it does just what the Supreme Court says, is make a relationship so people are not blackmailed into lawsuits, into settlements like the doctors were. Once those limits were put on doctors, on doctors being sued for punitive damages and what those damages could cost, the number of lawsuits dropped against doctors. There were lots of meritorious cases that went to court, and people got what they deserved, but it stabilized the physician practices and made sure there was access to care. That's all we're asking.
All right, you'll keep us updated, and then at one point, as I said, we're going to have you come back. I want to talk about what seniors should do to prepare. Something I know, you get up there in age, you got to think about a nursing home, you got to think about assisted care. You're going to come in and tell folks what they should do to prepare for that, right?
Absolutely.
All right, here coming up, two of the state's leading journalists are going to get into the big issues of the week in the state capitol. We'll do that after we pay some bills.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania, and by the Pennsylvania Coal Alliance, representing companies involved in America's most affordable, reliable energy source. To learn more, visit pacoalalliance.com.
Welcome back to the program. We have two of the state's top reporters, Tony Romeo, KYW, KDKA, I'll get that out, radio, and Brad Bumsted with the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review. These guys have been covering the Capitol for decades. I hate to use that, but last week we had breaking news, right? Another breaking news day. Governor Corbett left the governor's office, appointed Eric Arneson to head the Open Records Law or office. It was challenged in court. The argument was that the governor could not do what?
Fire him.
Fire him, yeah.
And it happened shortly after Wolf was sworn in. One of his first acts was to fire Eric Arneson, Corbett's appointee, to head the Office of Right to Know.
Yeah.
And that was significant in terms of the internal dynamics because he's a longtime Senate Republican aide,
right,
part of the Senate Republican family. The law aside, it was viewed as an aggressive act by Wolf. He said he just was doing it to make sure that the legislature respected him. That's what he told me in an interview.
To respect
well, he
him, yeah.
lost on this. The Commonwealth Court struck down his firing, and Jeffrey Sheridan, his Wolf spokesman, told me they are going to appeal.
They are. Well, that big surprise, right? We're going to have an appeal, right? Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, no surprise at all. But this ruling does seem to be a double blow this week now for the administration because, of course, it comes on the heel of the acting state police commissioner being voted down, his confirmation being voted down by the Senate. And one has to wonder if
we'll get to that. I want to come back to that in a minute.
Right, but
the
idea for me is if there's another court challenge brewing there because the governor has indicated he intends to keep Marcus Brown on as his acting superintendent.
So we're going to have two ongoing legal battles.
Well, but now we have a court also ruling against the governor and saying, no, that there are limits. You overstepped your authority here. Yeah. One has to wonder if that portends anything for a court battle on that issue, if there is one.
Yeah, that's all we need, more court battle. All right, let's pursue this a little bit. Do you think there's any concern out of the governor's office that a close Senate aide, Eric Arneson, heading the Open Records Office, where you get to, correct me if I'm wrong, approve folks like you who want to get information out of not just other branches, but the executive branch, that they'll be more aggressive about that?
There was undoubtedly that belief among some of the Wolf people. However, if they knew Eric Arneson and had dealt with him over the years, as Tony and I have, he's an eminently fair person. Yeah. and would probably bend over backwards to not, be sticking it to the Democrats. But undoubtedly that was part of the concern. So, and Wolf said, look, it was a midnight hour appointment by Corbett. It wasn't done right. He pledged to be a different kind of governor, and this is not the way things should be done right before you leave office.
Without getting into the rightness or the wrongness of what the governor did, I mean, past governors, as both of you have covered these, Tony, have historically made what they call these 11th hour appointments, the boards. Am I wrong about that? I mean, everyone, again, not getting into why the governor did it, but it's not unprecedented for Governor Corbett to do what he did.
Well, and as one high-ranking legislative leader said, the Constitution, is what it is. The governor's the governor until,
and he still has,
the last, the third Tuesday of January.
Right.
And so it's one of those things that it's hard to imagine how you remedy it. I mean, the governor is elected for a certain term, and he has certain powers and prerogatives.
All right, I'm going to get to Marcus Brown, but I'm going to give you the final word on this. In court, this could go on. Now, do we know yet whether does Arneson take the office now, or we don't know whether what the
we don't know, but usually when there's an appeal, it stays. They might have to make a separate move. But it would stay the action so that he wouldn't immediately take over.
Okay.
So it could be, by the end of the first year, even if he wins, that he could be installed as a right to know all director.
All right, nothing more controversial in the last 4 or 5 months in Harrisburg, Tony Romeo, than this whole business with the acting police commissioner who was what happened last week.
Well, what happened was that the Senate, in what seems to be unprecedented, at least in recent history, and by that I mean maybe the last couple of decades, the Senate actually voted down, in an actual head count roll call vote.
22, I think.
Right. Several Republicans, a handful of Republicans, I believe three that joined in voting, Democrats in voting for the nomination, but the nomination fell anyway. So that is highly unusual.
All right. We're going to run to a break. When we come back, I want to pursue this a little bit. I want to ask Brad. I'm asking these guys these tough questions. Can he stay in office? He's acting police commissioner. We'll get to that, and then I want to get to something called the sting. Pretty fascinating. We'll do that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Business Council and by the Pennsylvania Business Council Education Foundation.
All right, back to our discussions of the confirmation of Police Commissioner Marcus Brown with Brad Bumsted and Tony Romeo. All right, Brad, he's technically now not confirmed to be the police commissioner, but at this point the governor is keeping him on, correct?
Keeping him on as acting commissioner. Their belief is that there's no time limit on that and that he can do it indefinitely. The law, as I understand it, is not definitive. It's not clear on whether they can do that. However, the Constitution gives the Senate the power to advise and consent. They did not consent. So the Senate Republicans would view that as an end around on the Constitution by Governor Wolf.
Yeah.
So I agree with Tony that if this persists, we're likely to see a lawsuit over it.
I want to get to this thing. I'm going to finish with you on this. You've covered have you ever seen anything quite like this where there's a debate over the acting? I've never seen anything. Have you?
I've never seen anything, especially when there's no smoking gun. There's a series of things that the opponents say they're concerned about, but there's not one you can look at and say, wow, that just automatically disqualifies him.
All right, we're not talking about Robert Redford and Paul Newman in the great 70s movie The Sting, right? But we had a sting going on here where 6 people were ultimately charged with public corruption, in effect taking bribes, if I understand this correctly, 4 convictions, and there was a huge debate between the Attorney General, Kathleen Kane, and Seth Williams, the DA of Philly, about whether there was racial targeting. What's the big news of the past week on this?
Well, the big news of the past week is we had more pleas. We now have 4 guilty pleas out of the 6.
Right.
But the real underpinning of all of this is that Attorney General Kane said that the case was unprosecutable and that it was legally flawed, and that's why she did not pursue it. But when Seth Williams got the case, he did pursue it. He charged eventually 6 people, and he said it was a press and play case because there was videotape. Much like Abscam, these people were offered cash or gifts, and it was filmed by an undercover operative for the Attorney General's office. Seth Williams, I was at one of his press conferences where he said, you can just hit the video and show it to the grand jury or the jury. Here they are taking bribes.
Yeah.
Although they've pled the lesser charges, conflict of interest, and can keep their pensions.
And Tony, go ahead.
No, noteworthy, however, is that while you've had 4 guilty pleas, there are 2 that are pending, and 1 case is being fought. And the attorney for Louise Bishop, Representative Louise Bishop, is trying to make the case in court to prove racial targeting, which was one of the prime reasons that the Attorney General dropped the case. And the Attorney General's office in Philadelphia says there's not a shred of evidence to prove that. But nonetheless, we did have a proceeding, at least the start of the proceeding, on the effort by Bishop's attorney to try to prove that. We had an initial proceeding on that already.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of story. I mean, that's certainly, and Brad, you've written an awful lot about the Attorney General. This obviously is not helpful. I mean, when somebody else gets a conviction, when you said you couldn't get a conviction, and where all that goes.
It's not. And when you, in and of itself, it would not be that damaging. But when you combine it with all the other troubles that Kathleen Kane has had over the past year and a half, it does become damaging.
All right, we have about 1:30. I'm going to put you guys on the spot. Why not? Tony, budget by June 30. Do the Republicans get together and pass their own budget?
I think, yeah. If I had a gun to my head, I would say that the scenario is that they come together, put some kind of budget that represents their budget, they send it to the governor, and make him either veto some or all of it.
All right.
I agree that it'll be a Republican-type budget sent to Wolf that he'll have to veto, and they may just go home. They may leave, say, we sent you a budget. But the budget won't be resolved by June 30th, despite that.
Yeah, what will happen is that if there's one of 2 things will happen. If there's a total veto, then you're probably going to have a crisis situation with the threat or actual furloughing of non-essential state employees.
Whatever non-essential means.
Or a partial veto, which will allow government to function and leave the budget unresolved. And in that scenario, as Brad said, they might just go home for the summer.
I'm going to get the last word. Someone told me, and I can't be sure this is true, that casino workers are essential employees. Did you ever hear that?
That's true. That came up in the 2009 budget crisis with Governor Rendell. That court ruled in that.
There you go.
That fashion.
All right. With that fashion, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.